Hello and welcome to this Silverstripe screencast. In this episode we're going to be talking about how to add custom fields to a page. So the first thing we're going to do is take some inventory of what custom fields we need. And then we're going to look at how to create some database fields. And then we'll talk about field types, which you might be familiar with, but Silverstripe kind of has its own approach to those. And then we'll update the CMS interface so we can populate these new fields. And lastly, we'll go through the templates and add the new variables to pull in those custom fields. So for this tutorial, we're going to be working with the travel guide section again. In the previous lesson, we developed a list view of all the travel guide articles and then their detail pages, but most of these templates are still hard-coded with static content, and we need to integrate them with the CMS. So we're going to start looking at how to add some custom fields to these pages and make them really come to life. So let's first look at the page and see if we can identify some fields that need to be editable in the CMS. At first glance, we can see that the date of the article is one. Every record is timestamped with its creation time, which is contained in $created. And that could work in a pinch, but most of the time, content authors are going to want to have some control over the dates for these articles, since the created time is not necessarily the date that the article was published. So we'll create a custom field for the date. And next we have the number of comments. We'll skip that for now. We'll address that in a future tutorial that covers adding comments. Then we have the list of categories. This is another piece we can cover in a future lesson when we talk about data relationships. The image is also something we're going to skip for now because it's handled a bit differently and it probably merits its own tutorial. Now the short snippet of text that appears under the title and list view, that's sometimes called a teaser, and oftentimes this is just the first sentence or paragraph of the article. But to give the content author more control, we'll provide a custom field for the teaser, and if it's not populated, we'll fall back on the first sentence of the article. So that will cover our bases quite nicely. Now if we click through to the detail page, we do see that one additional field has been added for the author of the post, so we'll add that as well. Now since all these fields appear on the article page records, we only need to be working with that class. Remember, even though we see the fields on the article holder template, it doesn't necessarily mean those fields belong to the article holder. In this case, they appear in a loop of all the article page records, so that's where we'll define them. It's very important to maintain a clear conceptual separation of the template and the model. So let's define a new private static variable in articlepage.php. We'll call it db, and just set it to an empty array for now. The db array is the cornerstone of data modeling in Silverstripe. Its function is pretty simple. It maps a field name to a field type. So the keys of the array are going to represent the variables that you can invoke on the object, such as content, title, etc. And the values of the array are going to be the field type. We'll talk more about field types in just a moment, but for now, let's populate this array with the fields that we need. We'll define a field called date that will store appropriately a date. The teaser field will be simple text, and the author field will also be text. But since we know it will contain a short string of characters, which is a person's name, we can declare this as varchar, which by default is limited to 100 characters. Now, if this is all looking cryptic to you right now, just bear with me a moment. We'll cover what the field types are in just a second, but for now, let's just populate the array. Since we made changes to the database, let's run dev/build. And we should see some green text indicating that new fields have been created. And in this case, we actually created new tables because before this, there were no fields for article page or article holder, so there was no reason to have a table. Now let's talk about field types. If you've done a bit of databasing, you're probably familiar with field types. Simply put, it's a bit of metadata that informs the database what type of data will be stored in a given column. There are a number of reasons why this is a good idea. First of all, it wouldn't make sense to allocate the same amount of memory to a field that will only ever contain a postal code as a field that will contain 100,000 words of content. Secondly, by assigning a field type, the database can interact with each column in its own way. So for instance, two date fields can compare differently than two text fields. And trying to store the text LOL fail in a decimal field will simply fail. Some common field types in MySQL include varchar, which is a string of characters with a variable length. A boolean is a true or false value. An integer is a number with no decimals. And a date is just a year, month, and day. There are many, many other field types. These are just some of the main ones that you'll see a lot. Now, Silverstripe puts its own layer of abstraction over these database field types. Many of them overlap, such as varchar, boolean, and date, but a lot of them are unique to the Silverstripe framework as well. This is because a field type in Silverstripe not only informs the database how to store the data, but it also tells the template how it should display the data. For instance, a field type with the type text will escape any HTML that's contained in its value, but HTML text will not. In the database, they're both stored as text, but the custom field type HTML text has a very important effect on how Silverstripe handles the rendering of the data. We'll talk more about all the features afforded by custom field types in future lessons, but for now it's important to be mindful of what kinds of data you expect to be storing in each field and how you will display it. So how do you know which field types are available? Well, your best resource in this case is the source code. Just browse framework/model/field types, and in that directory, you'll see a list of PHP files whose names can all be used as field types. As of version 3.18 of the framework, these are all the types of fields you can use. Now this looks a bit daunting, but rest assured, 90% of the time you're only going to use a handful of these fields. So our database is now ready to store these fields on our new page type, so now it's time to offer the user a way to populate the fields in the CMS. Once again, we'll be dealing strictly with the article page class for this. Let's define a new method that exposes the API for updating the CMS interface for this page. The method getCMSFields is what the CMS invokes to create all the tabs and fields that we see in the editing interface. It should return a field list object. By storing the result of parent getCMSFields in a variable, we can start with all the fields that are in the parent class. If we skipped this step, the page would be missing many critical fields, such as the title, content, URL segment, etc. We can always remove some of these fields piecemeal, but it's best to start with everything in the parent class and then make our changes from there. In this case, we're going to want 3 new fields. Let's use the field list API to add some new form inputs. Okay, let's look at this step by step. First, we have this add field to tab root.main. As you probably guessed, we're adding a field to a tab in the CMS, but this root.main part might be a bit confusing. The tabs in a field list are identified using dot-separated syntax. This is because tabs can be nested in other tab sets, and digging through several levels to get the one tab you want to add to would be a bit tedious. The dot-separated string identifier allows you to traverse the tab set ancestrally, where the highest level is on the left, and the tab you want to add to is all the way on the right. The root tab is the highest level tab set, assigned to all pages. Most of the fields in the CMS are on the main tab, including title, menu title, and content. But if you were to choose any arbitrary name, the field list would automatically create that new tab for you. Let's look at this create method on the form field. Every form input has its own class in Silverstripe, and the number of available form fields reaches far beyond just those that are available in the HTML5 specification. For instance, the rich text editor you see in the CMS is an HTML editor field. The actual HTML output of that field is just a text area, but it brings in a lot of functionality through JavaScript and its configuration. So HTML form inputs and Silverstripe form fields are not one and the same. It's not uncommon in a Silverstripe project to create your own custom form fields that offer the rich editing experience you'd like to have. Now looking at the form field constructor, the first argument is the field name, and this should correspond exactly to the DB field that it's saving to. The second argument is an optional label for the field. If you leave this null, the label will be the name of the field, as we see in the case of our teaser field. Let's go into the CMS and edit any article page. Notice our new fields are at the bottom of the page. We'll try populating them and just ensure that it saves state. Now there are a couple usability issues we can address here. One is that the fields are all pinned to the bottom of the page below the content editor, making it difficult for the user to find. Fortunately, the add field to tab method accepts an optional argument to specify an existing field that the new field should come before. In this case, we want the fields to come before the content field. So let's add that as the last argument to add field to tab. And we see now that the fields appear above the content field, which is much better. Second, this date field is a bit awkward. It's not clear what date format it's expecting. If I try to add something, it comes back with a validation error and it gives me this cryptic error message. Asking the user to know all this rather than simply pointing to a date on a calendar isn't very friendly. So let's configure the date field to show a calendar. Every form field exposes a public API that you can use to configure the field. In this case, the setConfig method is native to the dateField class, but other fields expose different methods. On a text field, for instance, you might call setDescription or setMaxLength. Let's reload the edit screen in the CMS and see that our changes have taken effect. Most of the hard work is done now, and it's time to insert all the variables into our template and pull in the CMS content. In articleholder.ss and articlepage.ss, just replace any references to the date with $date, and author with $author, and teaser with $teaser. Reload the page and see that the articles are now pulling in the dynamic content. One issue we can see is that the date is not formatting the way it should. Since we casted the field as a date, we have some control over that at the template level. The long method of the date will give us what we need. Replace $date with date.long. Now this is where we really start to see the power of field types. If we had casted the date as just simple text, it wouldn't be able to do this. But instead, it's returning an intelligent object that can format itself. It can tell us if it's in the past. It can tell us if it's in the future. It can tell us how long ago it was. All these features are made available to us through the field type object. Now there are a number of methods available on the date class to help you get the format you want. You might try date.nice, or if you're in the USA, date.niceUS will give you a format that puts the month first. If all else fails, you can always invoke date.format, which essentially exposes PHP's date method, allowing you to pass a string of text to get the format you need. Lastly, we said earlier that we would like the teaser to be an optional field, falling back on the first sentence of the content if it isn't populated. So let's set all that up. We'll check if the teaser exists, and if not, we'll do content.firstSentence. All text-based field types in Silverstripe offer methods such as first sentence, first paragraph, limit character count, limit word count, etc., to give you some control over the presentation on the template. Using these methods to create teasers is very common. Okay, and it looks like everything is working. We're starting to pull in some dynamic content from the CMS. That's all for this episode. Thank you for tuning in, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below.